Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series, a production of the Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute. The SEI is a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. A transcript of today's podcast is posted on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts.
Welcome to the SEI Podcast Series. I'm Linda Parker Gates, and I'm the Initiative Lead for Software Acquisition Pathways in the SEI Software Solutions Division. Today I'm joined by Scott Hissam, who is working on software assurance in DoD systems. And Scott recently put together an event on free open source software and wrote a blog about the event, and that's what we're going to chat about today. Welcome, Scott.
Hello, how are you? Doing well, thank you.
Great. I'm fine, thanks. Nice to see you. Can you tell us what you're doing here at the SEI these days, what you work on?
Well, I've been at the Software Engineering Institute now a little over 2 decades, and since that time, my research has been primarily interested in component-based software engineering and integration of those, mostly focused around not only functionality but also the quality of the software itself, and that also includes the security of that software, which is a key quality attribute. And all that should apply to what we design and build and buy. From my perspective, it really doesn't matter if we're talking about proprietary software. Proprietary software is the type of software you would get from, say, a commercial company, and even open source software. And I like to call that free and open source software, or FOSS.
Yeah, so let's start there. Can you explain what we mean by free and open source software?
So you kind of have to go back a little bit in time and have this sense about where open source software came from. And it's been around, I should have done the math ahead of time, but 70 some years. I think there's a group, there's a couple authors who I know in Ireland, Feller and Fitzgerald. They did a book on open source software, and they traced the beginnings back to 1953 in a project called PAC. Can't remember at the moment what PAC stands for. There's others tracing the sharing of software back to 1955 with IBM and a project called Share, where they were trying to actually share software between companies and scientists that were using IBM mainframes. But it really wasn't until 1998, kind of going through the 70s and the 80s, when a person by the name of Christine Peterson is the one attributed to coining the phrase open source software. And the reason that this was done was because up to this point, the term of art seemed to be free software. And that was a little bit of a misnomer. It was basically conflating two concepts, where the real source or the real sense here is that open source software conveys the idea of freedom, freedom to do, freedom to understand, freedom to learn, not so much free as in, well, the quote is free as in free beer. And so I typically will use the word FOSS for free and open source software to underscore and convey that freedom and openness of the sharing of ideas in software.
Cool. I always wondered about how that word free, should be interpreted, given that it is right up against the word open, right? And I think it's sort of an underscoring of the use, how the software can be used. So the government, DoD organizations are using FOSS. Can you talk a little bit about how they're using it and how frequently they're using it?
Well, okay, so the federal government and in fact the Department of Defense, the largest agency. They're not really different than anyone else now in industry or even folks that live at home. Pretty much, whether you know it or not, and I'm not speaking to you specifically, Linda, but to the community at large, there's a lot of FOSS software, free and open source software, or FOSS, that is being used by practically everybody, from television sets to your Internet of Things to some major banking systems and major systems around the planet, and the DoD is not any immune to that. A lot of the software that's used in some of the core of the operating systems they use, even if they're from proprietary vendors, are benefiting from what has been learned over the past, well, 70 years of exchanging free and open ideas and free and open source software among each other. And so the DoD finds itself having to deal with open source software, free and open source software, all the time.
Well, so specifically then in the defense industrial base, the DIB, as we call it, what's going on there?
So in terms of the so there's a little interesting story, and I think it's important to bring this through is that the sort of in the mid 1990s, there was a gentleman by the name of David Wheeler. He at the time worked for one of the other FFRDCs, federally funded research and development centers in the United States, and he was at IDA. And he was able to convince the legal community at that time that, according to the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations, that open source software, or FOSS, was in fact a commercial item, and it was a commercial item because in the Federal Acquisition Regulations, anything was considered a commercial item if it was licensed, and in the FOSS community. Software is in fact licensed, but they fall under what's called free and open source licenses, like the MIT license, the Apache license, and even GPL. And there are a number of licenses well beyond what I just listed that are approved and recognized by the Open Source Initiative as free and open source licenses. So, given that the fact that FOSS is a commercial item, this brought FOSS to the same level as what is called proprietary software. That is also a commercial item. Commercial companies produce proprietary software, and so that put the Department of Defense into the situation of being able to not only recognize but also use FOSS as in acquisition of basically DoD mission systems. I think the first salient memo that I remember was in 2003. It's called the STEMBIT memo, and it pretty much outlined this exact point. And over the last 2 decades, the Department of Defense CIO office has been providing clarifying guidance on the use of open source software in DoD systems, including in 2009 and most recently in 2022. So this puts open source software on that same sort of level playing ground with proprietary software. And I think it's also important to note, and kind of going back to that free and free beer comment, is that this does not conflate or include the concept of software that is also known as freeware or shareware. Freeware and shareware, this kind of software sort of dominated the landscape in the 80s and 90s, and ended up becoming a vector for vulnerabilities for infecting organizations. A lot of this freeware and shareware is in fact binary based. They're binary based executables or artifacts. It's impossible to vet them. You don't have the source code to them. You have no idea what's in them. And so I like to be careful and separate the FOSS free and open source software from these malicious and malignant types of freeware and shareware that used to permeate the landscape.
Right. So you mentioned guidance coming from the DoD CIO's office. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, actually, I think it was the most recent memo, the 2022, and I'll talk specifically to that one. I thought it was a very exciting memo, and they tried to, and something the author from that office, his name is Dan Reisacker, the way that he lined this out was along three perspectives, right? One was from the consumer perspective, one was from the producer perspective, and the third was from the collaborator perspective. And let me walk through that just a little bit. From the consumer perspective, it takes, I think, a very healthy perspective. It says, focus on adopt, buy, create. And that was that was a mantra that was laid out in that memo. So the first idea is when there's a step in acquisition which considers something called analysis of alternatives. And in that analysis of alternatives, where you're trying to make choices between competing products, the memo wants to make it clear that open FOSS software, FOSS, is in fact a shelf in the marketplace that you can pick from as an alternative. And the memo wants the DoD community to adopt FOSS when it's possible. If there is nothing available in the marketplace that can be adopted from the FOSS community, then the buy. That's where they adopt buy. Then the decision comes down to buying something from the proprietary or commercial portion of that marketplace. And finally, if you can't adopt and you can't buy, then you build or create. And that's not uncommon given a DoD mission. And so the whole point here is to try to avoid creating new, if you are creating something, try to avoid creating new versions and adhere to open source licenses. That's from the consumer perspective. From the producer perspective, when we can't adopt, we can't buy, and we create, the mantra now is make it open by default. The guidance from the DoD CIO office is, where possible, the software that you create should be open by default and should be released as open source software. Recognizing that what's released has to be non-proprietary and disclosable to basically the world, right? And there are certain exclusions about what that means to be disclosable or not in the memo. And finally, the third point is collaborator. So in this perspective, it's not so much that the DoD is producing a new component or even consuming a component, but what they want to be able to do is be able to collaborate with the FOSS community to contribute new code. And the memo makes it clear that government civilians, military personnel, and even contractors can contribute to FOSS communities while they're on duty, as long as it's in the benefit of that DoD program, and for contractors, if the contract allows it. And probably the most important thing with collaborating is avoid trying to make DoD-specific versions in fork. So when you're contributing code to the open source community, you work with that community, adhere to their processes, their review processes, and their release processes, so that your changes can be folded in to those upstream processes.
Yeah, that's really good. I know there's a downside though, because there always is, right? So what are the what are the caveats, Scott, around using free and open source software? Free open source software.
I think I'm going to go in reverse, right? So now from that, I just talked about the collaborator, right? So from that collaborator perspective, while they're working with the open source software community, they're reminded that they need to maintain operational security. And what operational security means for any civilian, military, or contracting working on a DoD program is really specific to that program, and they have to know what that means. So they have to be able to maintain operational security. For me to say what that actually means for any specific program, I just couldn't. It's hard to be general about that. In a producer standpoint, okay, we tried to adopt, we tried to buy. Now we're creating. So now we're producing, and we're doing it by open by default, and releasing that open source code. And the key here is that when producing and releasing that code, you have to follow disclosure processes. There are ways of disclosing information from a DoD program to the general public. You have to follow those processes.
So the government is doing something about these risks, it sounds like.
Well, right. They are in fact, and I think that I think the most the other interesting thing about a producer, I want to say, is that they also have to be in a position as the producer to be the maintainer. So they have to have the budget and they have to have the ability to manage fixes and enhancements from the community back into uh, those within the DoD that are actually producing that open by default. And I think the last important one is the consumer role, and this is where it gets. This is probably the biggest problem of that consumer producer collaborator role, right? And that's the one of being able, you can do all these things to adopt and use open source software in the DoD as a consumer, but you have to be able to manage supply chain risk. You have to be able to manage software assurance. That's where my research and my interests right now are, right? And in managing that supply chain risk, when you're consuming FOSS, you have to be cognizant of long-term support, using trusted sources. That in itself is a challenge. You have to deeply understand the dependencies of the open source software that you're bringing, because those dependencies have their own dependencies. And you have to make sure that the software is vulnerability free, and there's techniques for doing that, of course. And you have to be cognizant of malicious actors in the supply chain.
You shared an example with me the other day about sort of an analogy to bolts. Do you remember?
Right.
That?
Yeah. So here up to this point, we've been talking about software and open source and software supply chain risk. And when I think about software supply chain risk, I like to use the bolt analogy, right? And the bolt analogy is there are rules in the DoD that when they use a component, it doesn't matter if it's a processor, an engine, or parts in an engine, or a bolt, right? They need to know that when they start using that product, that they can expect to be able to use that product for very long-lived systems. And so for me, when I'm going to home improvement store and I'm getting parts for my deck, so let's just say I'm buying a bolt to bolt my deck to my house, right? I'm just not going to buy any bolt. I'm going to buy a bolt that I know can hold the deck to the house and not collapse. And so you're looking for a specific bolt of a specific size that has certain strengths and certain characteristics. The DoD has to do that. They do the same thing, but they also say, well, I'm also buying this bolt from this company. Is this company itself known to use good practices? How do they ensure that the products that they produce are in fact quality products, and how do I know that? And so they say that they adhere to certain standards, that they adhere to certain testing standards, and we see those kind of things all the time. The same thing is what the DoD is trying to do now with managing supply chain risk for software, not only from a security standpoint and vulnerability free, but also to know that the software itself has a certain level of quality. It's been tested, and the community or the producer that's producing that software is in fact going to be around for a long time. There are in the Linux community, and folks listening to this may understand that there are but free and open source software distributions of the Linux operating system with its desktop environment. Some of these companies actually give you guarantees. They say, if you use our Linux distro, we will maintain it for so many years, and we will maintain security updates sometimes even longer than that. So I feel when I use that desktop environment, I can rely on that particular distro to give me assurances for the next 5-10 years that I will continue to receive security updates for as long as I have that particular version of software before I'm forced into an upgrade situation. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So there was recently a presidential memo, I guess May 2021, about improving the nation's cybersecurity posture. How does that relate to this work that you've been doing?
Yes, it's called the Executive Order on Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. I think it's Executive Order 14028. And basically, it called for a number of organizations and agencies to improve their cybersecurity posture for the nation and its critical infrastructures. And there was direct guidance. I don't have all the details of that, but there was very direct guidance to NIST to securing the software supply chain for the United States. And NIST NIST has completed that work. The result was two key documents. One's called 800-128, which is Secure Software Development Framework. And the other was a guidance on software supply chain risk management. Both of these were in direct response and responding to the order from the president at the time. What I think is fascinating in that is that although there was very specific guidance given in there for the supply chain, the NIST material was actually building upon, well, to NIST's credit, over a decade's worth of prior NIST standards, from configuration management and security configuration management, supply chain risk management, and even cyber security. Wait, let me get that right. Cyber supply chain risk management. All those documents were updated and pretty much in response to that presidential memo. Following that memo, the Office of Management and Budget just released in September Memorandum M2218, I think, or 1218. I can't remember now. I think, it was 2218. And it was called Securing Supply Chain Through the SSDF. There's the reference back to NIST on the Secure Software Development Framework. And those just came out. And basically, that material there's a lot in there, all right? And that's okay. But it basically came down to two big important pieces. One is directing and requiring DoD agencies, or actually, I think it was, Title 31 agencies, to start using software bill of materials. These are basically lists of, think of a software bill of materials being the ingredients in something you buy, right? It says, here are all the components that make up the thing you just bought.
That IKEA parts list that you get?
Yeah, just exactly that. It comes with its own problems and its own risks, but the guidance is clear, and they want the Department of Defense and the Defense Industrial Base and the producers that produce software to provide software bill of materials for the software that you acquire from them. And also, and that. And then the other aspect that's important in the OMB is an attestation statement that the producer that produced the software you got it from attests to following rigorous standards for software development. And the details are in the memo, right? And what that means for attestation. And now, for the work that we're doing, we're trying to roll those. What does it mean for a DoD organization to actually consume these attestations? What does it mean for a DoD organization to consume these software bill of materials, and what do they do with them, right? Interestingly, that memo came out in May of 2021, like you identified. The audience on this podcast may remember that there was also the famous Log4j fiasco came out in that fall. And there was a number of hearings, there was a number of critical infrastructure implications of the Log4j hit. And given that focus from that executive order, there's now a new bill making its way through Congress now called the Securing Open Source Security Act of 2022. So put a pin in that, and we'll see how that comes out.
I want to bring us back to the SEI, though. We're a small, relative to the DoD, we're a small FFRDC, a federally funded research and development center. What is our role in the FOSS landscape? And what are we doing?
So, as you know, and maybe not everybody knows, the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon is the only federally funded research and development center that's chartered to look at software processes, software technology, or software techniques, software processes, right? We don't necessarily differentiate between free and open source software and proprietary software. It's software. But recognize that there are differences when one is beginning to think about software assurance and when thinking about software supply chain risks when it comes to open source software. So my job recently has been trying to get insight into those projects that are actually contributing and producing free and open source software, which is actually being used within the Department of Defense. We had, you mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, we had a workshop, and the blog for that workshop is listed at the bottom of this podcast. But one of the things that was very important coming out of that workshop was the concern the DoD had at sort of the highest level, but also from the folks, on the floor developing software, is being able to get insight into objective evidence of the health and stability of some of these open source software products. And then how do we get insight to what they do? And as explained in the blog, there was a very clear message, and I appreciated the message that we heard, was that buy-in and trust the process of the open source software community. But that in and of itself, although it's wonderful to have that, and I want to be able to do that, I need to have that evidence that tells me that what I think is occurring within that open source project actually is doing that. And the FOSS community heard that concern loud and clear and gave us, in the workshop, not only myself, but some of the DoD folks that were attending there, pointers and hints to tools that would actually help us get that objective evidence into those concerns.
See, you convened that workshop, this was back in June, as an unconference. Can you tell us more about that and some of the key outcomes?
Well, so it is. So this is in my mind, it is a huge topic. Okay, and you can look at this from so many different perspectives that I think it almost made my head spin. So the idea of bringing, first off, who do I bring together? Who should come together? I make it sound like it's me, but it's not. I was just convening the discussion. But who should come together, and what are we going to talk about? And so I started small. I had a few contacts in the FOSS community. Those people knew people, those people knew people, those people knew people. So you've sort of got that network. And I'd like to say this happened by design, but it didn't happen by design. It happened this way. And what we ended up getting was a number of different foundations that wanted to come and talk about the topic. The topic was really about how the DoD would get its hands around FOSS from a supply chain software assurance perspective. So a number of the foundations showed up. Folks from the defense industrial base, more in the cloud area, came. Some DoD organizations came. Some federal organizations came. And we now had sort of a critical mass to have that, to begin that discussion. And so rather than me thinking, well, this is what I want to talk about, the idea was then let's really take it from an unconference perspective and discuss just start talking and then just start identifying topics. And we And I think over the course of the meeting, we generated about 12 different topics, about a dozen topics or so. And in that unconference style, we all used a voting scheme to say, what do we think we really want to talk about? What should we try to tackle first? And lo and behold, and maybe this happened by accident, or maybe it was subconsciously by design, but the top 5 I thought were really perfect for my immediate needs, right? And they were trust the open source software and the FOSS processes over any specific individual. Risk management when dealing with the consumption, that's that consume, produce, collaborate perspective from the DoD CIO memo, but the risk management perspective of consumption of FOSS, actually getting hands on supply chain artifacts from those communities that are producing that software. And then how do we keep these structures, how do we keep this discussion going between, those that were in the workshop and the community around it. It was from those discussions that vectored me off now in doing some very specific, experiments is a strong word, but trials of ideas. And I'm in the midst of doing that now.
So what's next?
Well, so if things go the way I hope they go, I have a framework. I hate the word framework. I don't know what else to call it. But I have an approach that I think may actually give us that objective evidence that's necessary to understand the community that's producing these products. And I'm in the process now of starting. I've done some internal reviews of this. I am now slowly working these reviews out to others in the community, not only our stakeholders within the DoD, but also some of the individuals that were actually in that workshop. And I'm hoping very soon to be able to broaden that that lens on that work soon.
And I know you're working on ways to bring the results of all of these conversations back to the community. And that's a big part of.
For me, I think the most important thing is I really feel I got a lot of great information from that first workshop. I want to give back, okay, and I want to be able to give them, let them see that that not only I listened, but the DoD side of that conversation listened, and this is what we're trying, and what were the things that seemed to work well, and where are we still struggling with being able to get that objective insight and trusting that these communities in these projects are doing the things they say they're doing.
So there will be a link to the blog in the transcript of this session. And I'm looking forward to, I can recommend the blog already because I've read it, and I look forward to what else comes down the road from this work that you're doing. And so I just want to say thanks for talking with us today. And again, we will include links to the transcript and to the resources that Scott mentioned. And finally, do you have something else you wanted to say, Scott?
I don't think so. I thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to let folks know more about this, and hopefully leave your comments in the blog.
Right. So yeah, as a final reminder to the audience, our podcasts are available on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, as well as the SEI's YouTube channel. And so if you like what you see there, please give us a thumbs up. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you again, and thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining us. This episode is available where you download podcasts, including SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. It is also available on the SEI website at sei.cmu.edu/podcasts and the SEI's YouTube channel. This copyrighted work is made available through the Software Engineering Institute. a federally funded research and development center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Defense. For more information about the SEI and this work, please visit www.sei.cmu.edu. As always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email us at info@sei.cmu.edu. Thank you.